Let's look at the numbers today. 625 new COVID-19 cases in Ontario. That is up from yesterday. Ottawa has 64 of those cases. This morning, health officials provided the latest projections for the province. They say, based on the current prediction, and this is if we continue along the same trajectory, that we could be seeing case counts like 1,000 cases a day by the first half of October. COVID cases are growing, not just in young people. They say the rise in cases in young people has begun to spill over into older people, which could be tragic for our healthcare system. Right now, cases are doubling every 10 to 12 days. Premier Doug Ford called the numbers deeply concerning, but there were no new public health measures announced today. And when the province was asked, are you going to implement new restrictions, his answer was, not yet.
We aren't rolling back today. I'm not saying it's never going to happen, but today that's not a conversation that's going to happen in Cabinet. We're going to take the advice from Dr. Williams and the team like we always have.
Joining us once again, Dr. Raywat Deonandan, an epidemiologist who is a regular guest on this show. Welcome back.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for coming back on the program. So the projection there, Dr. Deonandan, says cases could rise above 1,000 a day. It's a pretty high case count to expect by mid-October. How accurate do you think that is?
I think that one's pretty accurate because we're already at 700 and 600 per day now, right? So 1,000 isn't that much of a stretch. So the way the modeling is done is they look at what's happened in other parts of the world and apply the Ontario dynamics and characteristics to those situations. In particular, they looked at Michigan, the first wave here in Ontario back in March, and Australia. The Australia one is particularly potent because in many ways we have been following their trajectory pretty closely. And what we see in the Southern Hemisphere is pretty much our future when it comes to things like the flu and COVID. And they saw a pretty brutal second wave with a lot more deaths and suffering than the first wave. So we're hoping to avoid that scenario, but it's looking like that's how it might go if we do things poorly here.
So they said the numbers are similar to Victoria, Australia, and that includes the city of Melbourne. And there, they have some pretty strict measures. I mean, they had police patrolling the streets at night, enforcing a curfew, a ban on wedding gatherings. Only one person per household is allowed to leave their home once a day outside of those curfew hours, and it's to pick up essential goods. They also have to stay within a 5-kilometer radius of their home. So Dr. Williams was asked about that today, and he said, we're looking at that quite vaguely. He said we're going to consider what works and what doesn't. What do you think? Should we be considering any of that? And is it fair to compare us to Australia?
I'm afraid to say something because I've been branded a fear peddler, which is surprising to me because I think I'm one of the more optimistic people commenting about this. But yeah, we should consider some of it. And here's why. Time and time
again.
Curfews?
We should consider curfews?
No, not curfews, but some of the stuff like closing wedding banquets, restricting indoor dining, closing places of worship, restricting, if not closing, gyms, really reducing the number of people that can gather in an indoor environment, diminishing the possibility of visiting people in houses in which you do not live. These things can matter, and the earlier we do them, the less likely we'll need to do more of it in the future. So the lesson is, act hard, act early, and therefore you can act in a smaller time frame and not have to shut down the entire economy. Now, the Australian situation is extreme, and they acted a bit late, which is why they had to go so hard. So the lesson is we should do some more serious things earlier to avoid having to do the extreme things that Australia did.
What do you make of doctors like Dr. Susan Richardson? We had her on the show earlier. She's a retired infectious disease physician, a medical microbiologist, and she is just one of these 21 doctors that have signed this joint letter to the Premier urging him not to issue a new lockdown this fall. And I spoke to her earlier, and she was saying, yes, the case count is rising, but she believes we're testing more people, that there are milder people that are having infections, and she said this is different than in the spring. She doesn't feel like a lockdown makes entire sense and says we have to factor in the economy here.
I think there's some truth to what she's saying. And, I don't want to, diminish the arguments made by other professionals, of course not. But she's right that it seems to be affecting a different demographic. I do not expect the death count to be as high this time around for a number of reasons. One is a younger demographic is being mostly affected. Two is our long-term care facilities are better protected, not perfectly protected, but better protected. But what I do expect is that we will be compromising our ICU capacity. And that's that's bad. That means that things like elective surgeries will have to be canceled. That means that we should be afraid of seeking health care. So we won't have the horrific situation we had in some parts of the world where there isn't enough space in the morgue for the dead. What we will have is overcrowded hospitals, and that's bad enough. So I agree that we probably don't need a complete lockdown. I think we can avoid that if we are strategic and start early with some more harsh proactive measures, like closing the bars, and also by investing more in public health capacity. Like our contact tracing capacity is limited. That's why we have so many untraceable cases right now in Ontario. What we need is more resources and more tools, more testing capacity, more lab capacity. That stuff will allow us, or at least diminishes the likelihood of having to have a second lockdown. So I'm on board with avoiding a second lockdown if we can, and we do that by having these other controls enacted earlier.
What about the medical technologists? I mean, it really seems like there's a huge backlog on the back end. We don't have enough of them.
That's right. So the capacity issue is complicated. It's not just about swabs. It's lab capacity. It's reagents. It's staff. That stuff can be addressed. People need jobs. There are medical technologists out there who need jobs, who can get them. We have commercial labs that could help fill that gap. We have university labs as well. There are things we can do. And what we're not hearing is that same sense of urgency from the public health leadership in the province. So there doesn't seem to be a marriage between the direness of the projections and the seriousness of the public health response. And that's a little confusing.
What if we did a shortened lockdown? This 28-day stint that they're doing in Quebec, and who knows, that could be extended, right? I can't read into the future. I can't forecast that. But they're saying 28 days, don't visit people outside of your home, don't have them in your home, don't even go to the park. They were saying, don't go to the park and hang out with people. They shut down bars, they shut down restaurants, they've shut down movie theaters. They're keeping spas, salons, as well as shopping malls open, gyms open. But they're doing that for 28 days. Would something like that make sense here?
Yeah, that's the elimination strategy, or the extreme suppression strategy. And that works. I think you have to have the malls closed too, and the salons, everything's closed. The idea is if you eliminate every possibility for transmission, every possibility for a couple of disease cycles, which are 28 days, then you might be able to eliminate infection from the community entirely. But then you'd have to seal the borders to prevent new infection from coming in. So this has been considered by several countries around the world, and it's not a bad thing to consider if you're willing to pay that price and willing to be isolated afterwards, because it only buys you some time before the new infections arrive. And again, if you're not going to go for elimination, what Quebec seems to be going for is hard suppression. Drive the case numbers down really hard, and then dance again. That's valid too. So it's hammer down and dance. But you can only dance if you know the steps. That's what Bogosh famously said recently. And right now we're supposed to be dancing, but we've missed a few steps, and so we have the second wave upon us. We could do something similar, drive the case down, load down, and then redeploy our public health assets and continue to dance. It's an option, but it would be a costly option.
So then what do you make of what our neighbors are doing in Quebec, where they're keeping the shopping malls open, they're keeping the salons and gyms and spas open? It's not a complete lockdown.
No, exactly. And I'm wondering what the intent is. Is it elimination or is it hard suppression so that they can dance? If it's the second, okay, I see it. I totally see it. It comes down to what you expect your population to do. Do you expect your population to be on board and comply? And when you lift that lockdown, will they then comply as they did not in the past, such that you don't have to do this again in a couple of months?
Health Canada has approved a rapid COVID-19 testing device today, the Abbott Laboratories ID machine, which can apparently get results in 15 minutes. Your thoughts on that, Dr. Deonandan?
Sure. These rapid tests are great. I'm a big fan of them. The controversy is in how to use them, because they tend to have a different sensitivity and specificity. I don't want to get too deep into statistics, but all that means is it's possible that they're going to give either a high false positive or a high false negative rate. That's okay if you use them in the right way. So tests can be used in one of three ways: as a diagnostic test, a screening test, or as surveillance tests. I think this one is a good surveillance test and possibly a screening test. It's not necessarily a great diagnostic test. It doesn't replace the PCR test. It just be used in a different place in society. And while that's being worked out, I think it's great that we now have it as a tool that we can deploy strategically.
Ottawa's medical officer of health said based on the current trajectory, for us locally, we could see 200 new cases of COVID a day by mid-October. She said it was alarming. She also said it is not a rule, but it is a piece of advice that she would like people to spend Thanksgiving with their own households. It's an ask. Do you think it's going to work?
Again, I'm a stupid optimist. I expect people to do...
Are you really? Even through all of this, you still are?
I am. You have to be, right? Or else you become an idiot and unpleasant person. You know, I like to think the best of my fellow Canadians.
You're describing me to me.
Right, and I think most people will actually comply.
It's called cynical, Dr. Deonandan.
I mean, how do you enforce it if you make it a rule? I mean, you can't enforce it. So it's better to recommend it and have the goodwill of people on board than to require it and suddenly create resentment and therefore anti-authoritarian reactions that lead to non-compliance. It's a delicate balancing act that the rule makers have to dance, and I think it's right to recommend it but not enforce it at the moment until things become really bad. Then the heavy hand of the law has to come down and do some draconian authoritarian things.
Here's the thing about that. I just had a movie theater owner from Quebec on earlier. He owns a chain of movie theaters. And he actually suggested in the last couple minutes of the conversation that he's consulting with other people in the entertainment industry and that he's reaching out to a lawyer and thinking about trying to get some sort of an injunction, a court order to fight the closure. And I wonder, and I'm fearful, I guess, that this is where the conversation goes. Because there's even tension within the medical community, right? Your opinion is different than your colleague's opinion. You've got 21 doctors signing one letter and then 25 doctors signing another. And this just feels like the climate that we're in right now.
A little bit, but it's not like climate change. I mean, it's a bit like climate change where, the deniers, even amongst the professionals...
Right, no, of course.
They're in the minority. Keep that in mind. So the majority opinion is still that we need to do something harsh. I think the legal path is probably going to be followed by some people, and I think it'll eat up some court time, but it probably won't go anywhere because ultimately government can always play the emergency measures card and say that in a time of extreme public health emergency, we must take these extraordinary actions to curtail the regular freedoms of society. I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I imagine would happen.
You are an optimist, though. Thanks for clarifying that. Dr. Raywat Deonandan, the optimist and the epidemiologist. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon.